Although Christians are not Jews, Christianity arose in an area of the world where Judaism developed, and also in the area of the world where Judaism was one of the major religions back in the time when Jesus lived. Additionally, when the early Christians decided to choose what they wanted to put in Christian scripture, they chose to make the Jewish scriptures as our Old Testament, because many Christians believe Jesus is foretold in the Old Testament. And for these reasons, Judaism is an interesting and important subject for us as Christians. Now, when most of us think of Judaism, we think of modern Judaism. We think of Judaism as it developed in Central Europe, usually. That what we think of when we think of Judaism is a Central European kind of Judaism that developed 200 or 300 years ago, and when we think of Jewish stuff, that's what we think about, Central European Judaism. But what was everyday life Judaism like in Old Testament times and during the time of Jesus? You know, if you think about it, the Old Testament itself really doesn't tell us. The Old Testament doesn't outline what we would call everyday, day-to-day Judaism in the lives of the people. Now, some people go to things the Old Testament does say and try to reconstruct that, but really there's not enough to reconstruct it. And so Judaism, as it was practiced in the everyday lives of people in the later Old Testament period and the New Testament period, is sort of a mystery. We don't know for sure what it was like back then. But one thing has survived in the historical record that tells us a little about Judaism in the everyday lives of people in the latter Old Testament period and for several hundred years afterwards. It came to light as the result of an archaeological discovery around the turn of the 20th century, and most Christians have never heard of it. But it is, in fact, the single most important archaeological find, I think, related to New Testament times. Now, this discovery is known as the Elephantine Papyri. And papyri just means writings. You know, an early form of paper was papyrus. It was made out of a papyrus plant. And papyri is the plural of that. So it's literally the Elephantine writings. And these are writings, some of which are from Jews that are from the latter Old Testament period. It is the most comprehensive source of information ever found about the everyday lives of Jews. Now, these writings were discovered over a period of time around the turn of the 20th century on Elephantine Island, which is an island in the southern part of the Nile River in southern Egypt. And Elephantine is a fairly large island, and people live on it. And there were people living on it back in biblical times. And these writings cover a period of about 1,000-year time period, beginning about maybe the year 600 or 500 and extending on up until even the time after Jesus. But what makes it so interesting for us is that for several hundred years there was a fairly large group of Jews living on Elephantine Island. No one knows why these Jews went there or what they were doing there or when they went there. There's different and conflicting opinions on it, but all we know is they were there, and they were there about 600 years at least before the time of Jesus, and they were there for many, many generations. And many of these Elephantine writings are either by or about these Jews. But these writings are not like books of the Bible. They're not religious writings. They are everyday life types of things. They are property deeds, marriage agreements, divorce agreements, letters, various kinds of government documents, business documents, contracts, and things like that. Some are in such fragile shape they have never been read because archaeologists feel that even handling them might cause them to fall apart. But the ones that have been read provide a unique window into the everyday lives of a group of Jews in biblical times. how they lived and practiced their religion. Now, several surprising things came out of these writings, but the one thing that is the most shocking is that the Elephantine Jews had their own temple on Elephantine Island that was very comparable in size to the temple that was in Jerusalem in the Old Testament. The writings don't indicate when this temple was built, but we do know that it was in existence during the latter part of the Old Testament period. Now, why is this so shocking? Well, the only temple the Old Testament mentions is the one in Jerusalem, and the Old Testament is interpreted in several places as saying that this is to be the only temple and that this is to be the only place sacrifices are offered. Now, based on this, up until the discovery of the Elephantine writings, biblical scholars and historians assumed that the temple in Jerusalem was the only one that had ever existed. But then the discovery of the Elephantine writings changed all that, and it was clear that there was more than one temple, because there was one on Elephantine Island very similar in size and construction to the one in Jerusalem. And they know that the Elephantine Jews offered sacrifices there. So, we have to think for a minute. Was this a rogue group of Jews that had just broken off from official Judaism and gone to Elephantine Island to go their own way? No, it wasn't, because some of the Elephantine writings are correspondence that these Jews had had with the Jews in Jerusalem, and it's obvious from those writings that the official Jews in Jerusalem knew about this temple and even approved of it. Now, as surprising as the existence of that temple is, the fact that these writings don't give the impression it was anything unusual opens up the possibility that there could, of course, been other Jewish temples. It opens up the possibility that Jews had many temples scattered all over the place. After all, the only way we know about this one was because of the Elephantine writings, and if they had never been found, we'd not have known about it. So who knows what other writings might mention other temples that existed. But the surprises don't stop there. From the Elephantine writings, we know the location of this temple on Elephantine writing, and it was on Elephantine Island, and it was in what could be called Temple Road. There it was there alongside a lot of other temples to different gods, and also we also know that the Jews worshipped in those temples also. They worshipped their God in their temple, but they also worshipped other gods and other temples. And this tells us that these people were not monotheistic. In other words, they did not just believe in one God. They were what is called henotheistic, which means that they believe many gods exist, and usually you think many gods exist and there is a God responsible for every little thing, and you just choose one to worship. That's henotheism. Now, in the Jewish Elephantine writings, they call their God Yahu. That's the Aramaic way of writing the name of God that's popular in the Old Testament. You know, we've talked about that before, that there's disagreement whether it should be pronounced Yahweh or Jehovah, and no one knows how Yahu should be pronounced. I'm just pronouncing it that way because that's the way it looks to me, that it's Y-A-H-U. That's the way it looks to me written in English. But I don't know how they pronounce it. The Jews on Elephantine Island referred to Yahu as the God of the heavens. And this is an example of henotheism. They accept the existence of many gods. Each god is responsible for its own area. And they thought the God responsible for the heavens was Yahu. And here, heavens does not mean heaven in the context of where hopefully you go when you die. It just means the sky. And so they thought of Yahoo as the God of the sky, everything up in the sky. So they worship this God of the heavens principally, but not exclusively. They also worship other gods. Now, there are other archaeological findings besides the Elephantine writings that support the fact that the Hebrews and then the Jews worshiped many different gods. Because in archaeological sites in that part of the world, in the Holy Land as we call it, they have unearthed many stone idols, many stone carvings of various gods. And so it's clear that they worshiped other gods. But there's something else that's interesting. The Jews on Elephantine Island also worshipped a goddess they called Anat Yahu. That was a female goddess, the goddess of war. And the way that is constructed, Anat Yahu, that is the way it is constructed when they are saying that this goddess is the consort of Yahu. That means that they saw this goddess as being sort of like the wife of the Jewish god Yahu. So they believed Yahu was a male and they worshipped him, and they believed Yahu had a wife, Anat Yahu, and they also worshipped her. Now this is actually indicated in the Old Testament if you know where to look for it, and it's also indicated in other archaeological discoveries in the area of the Holy Land. They have unearthed things with inscriptions like Yahu and his Asherah, which means consort or wife. In Old Testament times, there was a fairly widespread belief among Jews that God had a wife. Now, the worship of a female deity in a society has implications for how society views the position of women, and this is reflected in the Elephantine writings. These writings give a different perspective on women in society than some people interpret the Old Testament as giving. Now, many people interpret the Old Testament as assigning women to a subservient place in society. But women are mentioned frequently in the Elephantine writings, and they are mentioned technically as being on a par in status with men. For example, the Old Testament only indicates that a man could initiate a divorce, but there are divorce proceeding records in the Elephantine writings that indicate that women could also indicate it. Many people make the assumption that in the Old Testament only a man could own property. But in the Elephantine writings, it's clear that women also own property. It's clear that women also conducted business on their own. In fact, from the Elephantine writings, it appears that women had an equal role and just as much freedom and the ability to operate in society independently as did men. And so from the Elephantine writings, we get a picture of the everyday life of Jews in biblical times. And it is much different than what many people imagine it to have been. And from the fact that these Jews were in contact with the Jewish officials, so to speak, in Jerusalem, indicates that this was not just a splinter group that had gone off like hermits to live their own ways. Now, numerous times in the Old Testament, the Jews are criticized for worshiping other gods. Prophets condemn it so often that you have to conclude that it was an everyday thing for them to worship other gods. Even the idea of God with his wife or consort is in there. The book of Jeremiah uses the phrase Queen of Heaven 2 times. It criticizes the people for making sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven. Now, if God is the God of heaven or the King of heaven, then his wife would be the Queen of Heaven. So this is the same thing we find in the Elephantine writings. And while the Old Testament does not mention multiple official temples, it does include the phrase high places many times. which biblical scholars tell us is a term that is used to where they offered sacrifices outside the temple. Now, were these high places actually temples like the Jews on Elephantine Island had? We don't know. But at any rate, it is obvious that they did have other places that they offered sacrifices rather than the temple. So the importance of these Elephantine writings is that they give us a picture of Judaism and how it was actually practiced in the lives of people. The Old Testament doesn't give us that. So the way it's usually been imagined in our popular imagination is that Judaism was centered in Jerusalem, around that temple there, and that everybody's lives was centered on Judaism, and that everybody that lived there was basically a pure 100% Orthodox Jew. That's the picture that we so often imagine. But the Elephantine writings, together with things you can glean from the Old Testament itself, tell us that's not the way it was. In reality, Jews do not seem to have been monotheistic. They do not seem to have worshipped God exclusively. They worshipped other gods also. Judaism was not monotheistic, it was henotheistic. Jerusalem was not the only place they had a temple. The temple was not the only place they offered sacrifices. They also worshipped and offered sacrifices to a female deity, and they worshipped this female deity also. And so we get a very different picture than most of us imagine. When I was working on this sermon, I couldn't help but remember a class I had in seminary, and it was an education class. And we had to do something, an educational thing. We had to plan it and present it to class. It had to be some creative type thing. So some woman in there, she decided she would do a little one-character play based on a scene in the book of Ruth. And so she wanted to have everything, the stage set and the scene set. And so she had got her shawl and all this, that, and the other, and brought her little table and this, and she had her music playing. And not criticizing her, but I couldn't help but sitting there thinking, well, this woman's making the Jews in the Old Testament look like Central European Jews of 1920. Because she had gone back to what she thought of Jews, which is like Central European Jews of 1920 in the early 1900s. And thinking, well, this is how they were back in the Old Testament, with the music and the dancing and stuff like that. So I think that's what we tend to do when we think of Jesus and we think of Judaism during the time of Jesus. Our picture of Judaism, what we have been exposed to as Judaism in our popular culture, is Central European Judaism from around the turn of the 20th century. And we like to project that back and say, well, that's what it was like back during the time of Jesus, too. And the reason I think this is important is because that can affect our entire interpretation of Jesus. One of the more popular things to say about Jesus today, to emphasize about Jesus, is the Jewishness of Jesus. You don't have to read very far within Christianity today. You hear about Jesus being a Jew, and that was his primary identity, and we need to concentrate on the Jewishness of Jesus and all this, that, and the other. For the past 50 or so years, ever since World War II, that's been very popular in Christianity. That sometimes makes me very nervous, though, because we don't know much about Judaism in their biblical times or 2,000 years ago. And when we think about it, if we try to make it like Central European Judaism in 1920 or 1930, we're going to misinterpret Jesus by thinking about Jesus as a Jew. The reason I brought this up today is that I had a question from somebody that had read some of this stuff about the Jewishness of Jesus, and they were concerned about it. And I always think, well, if somebody has a question like that they're that concerned about to go to the trouble to ask me about, then maybe other people do too. But I thought it was interesting when we think of Judaism as it exists today, and we think of Judaism as it existed 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, we need to be sure that we keep the two separate. And we need to be sure that we don't project things back onto the Jews of Jesus' day and before that are really modern inventions.